We're going to take a look at your portfolio for college admission. I'll start out with some overall thoughts about your entire portfolio, and then we'll go through and we'll talk about each piece individually. The first thing I would say is you have outstanding technique, both in terms of drawing and painting. I see in a lot of your drawings that you have a very assertive, very bold look to your pieces. I think especially what I see in a lot of your charcoal drawings is you have an excellent sense of contrast, that there's a really broad range of grays. You're not afraid to put down some really deep, dark blacks, and also that in your paintings as well, there seems to always be a very prominent light source, and that's excellent because what that does is it really creates a very convincing sense of volumetric three-dimensional form, and that's almost across the board in all of your pieces. So I think that's excellent that you've really been able to utilize lighting to your advantage. I would also say one thing that I like about your pieces is that they seem all fully resolved. I would say you've got number 7, I think, is obviously unfinished, but I think definitely your paintings seem like every square inch of the entire canvas has really been considered. I would say your drawings tend to be on the less finished side, and that's certainly something you can work on, but I think it's really apparent to me that you're a really hard worker and you're someone who's really comprehensive and thorough when it comes to really executing all of your pieces. I think the area I'd like you to improve upon, because your technique is so solid and outstanding, is you really got to experiment more in terms of your content and also in terms of your visual style. It seems like in a lot of the drawings and the paintings, you have one very particular way of painting and drawing. There's a few exceptions, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but I think that your technique is solid enough that it's time for you to step outside of that. It's time for you to try something that's really unfamiliar, that maybe goes against the grain of the way you're accustomed to drawing, because I think that once you get to a point where you really have a strong handle on fundamentals like lighting and form and color, which you do, it's really time to step outside of that, do something that's really outside of your comfort zone. So for example, instead of maybe articulating everything to such a high degree of detail and finish, what if you could say, for example, in some of these paintings, leave some parts of the paintings more blurry, have some areas that look a little bit more drastic in a way. Like, for example, if you look at a John Singer Sargent painting, what's remarkable about his paintings is he'll have certain parts of the portrait are very articulate and very detailed, but then if you look at other parts of the painting, it just looks like this gigantic swish of paint strokes that got put down in about 3 seconds. So he's somebody who's really able, I think, to balance very quick, very spontaneous gestural marks, but he can also do stuff that's more tightly rendered. And so what I'm seeing in a lot of your paintings is that you have a tendency to tightly render everything. And what I'm saying is that that may not be necessary, that maybe there's more you could do with that. I would also say in terms of experimentation, not just in terms of your technique, but also in terms of your subject matter, because a lot of the subject matter that you're dealing with, most of it feels like technical class exercises. And it's okay to have a few pieces like that, but I do feel right now that that's pretty much the dominant theme in your portfolio. The exceptions to that, I would say number 5, number 1, number 10, and number 11 a little bit. So those are the pieces where I feel that you are exploring some sort of narrative, you're trying to communicate a particular idea or some sort of theme. Those pieces are really important in a college portfolio because they don't just sort of show off your technique, they show that you're really thinking as an artist. And so that's, I think, the trap that a lot of high school students fall into, is that they get so wrapped up in polishing the technique that they have in their materials that they forget about the thinking process, the brainstorming process. And so I would really, really encourage you to beef up that part of your process. I don't know if you are used to doing thumbnail sketches or mind maps or any kind of brainstorming process within a sketchbook. If you're not, I would definitely get on that right away, because I'm not worried about your technique. Your technique is fantastic. You're not going to struggle in that area. But I think what you do need to do is start asking yourself as an artist, what are you interested in and what do you want to talk about? Because if you think about art history, artists are not known throughout history for painting pears well. They're known for having a particular idea, or maybe they were wrestling with some political theme, or they were telling some sort of story. So that's what I see is lacking in your portfolio is you've got the technique, but you don't really have a lot that you're talking about, with the exception of those few pieces that I was mentioning earlier. So if you can beef up that side of your portfolio, that is what's really going to distinguish you, because there's a million students out there who can render things to death and draw incredible details and things like that, but not everybody has a story to tell or something to communicate. So I would certainly push that. I also think that you need to really diversify your subject matter. Almost every single piece in this portfolio, I guess I would say every piece, with the exception of the still life, has a figure or a portrait in it. So it's good that you have portraits, but you don't want that to be your only subject matter. And again, you could do something a little bit more surrealistic, like in image number 1, but you really need to diversify that. I think it'd be really good for you to have a couple pieces where you really demonstrate your understanding of space, whether you want to do an outdoor landscape or if you want to do an interior space. That's one thing I don't really see in any of your pieces. In most of the drawings, it's either just a black background, or it's a backdrop, or there's no background at all. And so you have to think more about, where are you going to put these figures? Where do they exist? What is their context? Because the figure is important, that's for sure, but you can't just have a figure just be floating in this big black space. You have to give them some kind of context. And the environment can be communicative too. For example, I have taught a course at RISD which was entirely focused on spaces and how to communicate ideas through the articulation of space. And so that's definitely something that I would think about. Like if you're painting a person, where is that person? If you're painting a still life, where is that still life? There's a million different ways that you could just get a lot more innovative about the background, because backgrounds can be very powerful. It's just that a lot of people just don't do them. And so you end up with a lot of figures and objects that are just floating in this blank space. I would also say, in terms of your painting technique, I would really try to loosen up more. I feel that in a lot of your pieces, they're sort of overly rendered. I would say painting number 11, that is a painting where I see you starting to loosen up. I still think you can do more, but I think in a lot of these pieces, like I think particularly number 9 seems very sort of verbatim copied from a photograph. Number 3 as well, I think, is another image that just feels like it just was copied. And so I don't think that it's wrong to draw from a photograph. I mean, I draw from photographs myself, but I think if you're going to use photographic reference, you better be doing something to it. You better be interpreting it or manipulating it or merging it with something else. You don't want to just copy it, because that really is not an artistic exercise. That really is just pure technique. So I would just make sure that you just think about different ways you could handle the brush, because when I look at your paintings, you don't show your brushwork at all. And I think it'd be really good for you to look at the artists. I mentioned John Singer Sargent before. I think I would look at Velázquez. I would look at Frank Auerbach. Like, I would just really look at artists who show their brushwork. I would look at Jenny Saville. These are all artists who really show us how they painted. Like, if I look at your paintings, like if I look at number 9, I have no idea how it was painted. And so it's not to say that you cannot paint that way. Certainly, you know, there's a lot of artists who do, but I think at this stage in your career, because it is so early and you haven't gone to art school yet, you haven't tried everything that's out there, you really have to expand your vocabulary more. It's almost like you have a very limited set of words, and I would love to see you just expand that vocabulary exponentially. So if you want to make the painting really gestural, you can. If you want to make it more vivid, or if you want to make it more energetic, you can. It's just right now it seems like you have this one way of painting, and if you really want to improve as an artist, you have to try out different things. You have to really push that a lot more. All right, so let's go through and let's talk about each piece individually. This piece is actually, I think, one of your most compelling pieces in terms of the subject matter for a couple reasons. The facial expression It's a little bit distorted, but that's exactly what I like about it. I feel that a lot of the other faces you have, they seem a little generic. They seem like they're copied from photographs. This one is very expressionistic. In fact, it makes me think of the German expressionist painter Max Beckmann, who had a very severe way of painting that was very bold and powerful. I also really like the hair as a compositional element. The way the hair spreads and moves throughout the piece has a beautiful sense of fluidity, I think. And I also think the presence of the fish really changes this narrative, because you wonder what's happening in the scene. You start questioning, where is she and what are the fish? Are the fish supposed to be a symbol of something? So there's a lot of curiosity, I think, when I look at this piece. I really want to know what's going on. Whereas I think some of your other pieces, I look at it, I say, okay, it's a person, that's it, I'm done. I'm not really thinking further than that. This piece really does do that. This piece sustains my interest, keeps me thinking, keeps me questioning what it is that I'm looking at. Now, a couple things I would change about this piece. The first thing I would say is I don't think it's a great idea to stick her right in the middle of the page. Like, what if, for example, you had her body tilted at an angle, so it was more of a diagonal? What if you shifted her up into the upper left-hand corner? Putting things right in the middle of the page, that's like the default setting most high school students use for composition. That's what everybody does. I'm not saying that you should never ever do that. It's just that's what most people do. So if you think about composition and how you can get that to work for you, it can be really, really effective. I want more fish in this piece. And I love the fact that you have one fish that's going behind the neck. I wish there was more of that. I wish there were fish sort of flowing through her hair and behind her hair. I don't mind that her body is simplified, but I think if you added more fish that were just going off the edges of the page the same way that the hair is, I think it would just be a much more dynamic piece. So this piece, I think it's a great start. And this is definitely the direction I want you to go in terms of narrative. But I think that you can really pump up the technique in this. I mean, research fish. Look up all the different kinds of fish. I don't think fish are this simple. I think that there's a lot more going on. And if you can really look up and see how their fins are done and really get very expressive, I think this could be a really, really striking piece to look at. This is a beautifully painted still life. I think what I really enjoy about it is how you're so specific about the different variations of surfaces. Like, I look at that lime and I can see that it has a little bit of light on it. I can see how transparent and how glossy the bottle is. And then there's this very matte finish to the vase on the right-hand side. And then, of course, the pepper on the left also has that sheen. And also, your lighting's very consistent. And I think you did a great job of showing the shadow core, which is the darkest part of the shadow in the lime, but then also that little tiny bit of reflected light at the bottom of the lime is really beautifully seen. So what I really see in this piece that I think is very impressive is that, number one, you have a really good observational eye. It seems like you're really able to pick up on very small subtleties in the piece, and I think that's wonderful. Background-wise, I'm pretty bored because, first of all, the blue you have in the background is just one flat blue background. Nothing's going on at all. And if you were to reset your lighting so that maybe the light made shadows that were casting against that blue wall, then you would have something interesting. Because right now, the objects are really three-dimensional, but then they almost look like cutouts that have been stuck on a blue sheet of paper. And so by flattening the background like that, it's like you're losing so much depth to this piece. So really think about context. And then, of course, the table that they're sitting on is also really plain. There isn't a lot happening. So I think the thing about this piece is that everything's beautifully articulated, but the composition is pretty dull right now. Not a lot happening in the background. I really think you could use more objects. And what I would recommend you do is watch the tutorial that we have on artprof.org, where there's a whole section about how to set up a really dynamic still life, because actually a lot of people don't know how to do that very well. I'd really recommend you try that because you don't have issues painting the objects. That's totally fine and taken care of, but you really have to think about context. You have to create an environment for these objects to exist within, and then we're going to get interested in this piece. I would also say try to think about ways you can get the color to be less literal. Like right now in this piece, the lime is green, the vase is orange, and the pepper is red. And I really think that if you look harder, you may see more different types of colors in there. It seems like there should be more opportunities for that. Like sometimes if you have like a little bit of that orange in the vase, maybe some of that's reflected on top of the green. So I would try a little bit harder to not isolate your colors too much, because the more you can get the colors to leak into each other, the more unusual it is. Like one artist I would definitely look at is Sargent, who was a very famous still life French painter, and he did just these gorgeous, really luscious still lifes. And what was really surprising about his pieces is the subtlety of color was so unexpected. Things weren't so literal. And so that's what I would try to avoid in your paintings, is having the lime be green, having the tomato be red. I mean, why couldn't you have a little hint of green in that red somewhere? So think about ways that with your color, you could maybe surprise us a little bit more, because right now I feel like you're just handing me exactly what I see, and it's so literal and predictable that I'm just not as interested as a viewer. Okay, so this piece, again, very accomplished, I would say, in terms of the modeling, especially in the head. I think you have a very nice sense of the cheekbone, especially on the left-hand side. You have a very dramatic shadow. And I would say that shadow, I think, is a great example of less conventional colors, because the shadow core is this sort of warm magenta tone, but then there's this very pale green that's creating reflected light on the left-hand side. And you're doing some nice things in the hand, like there's a little hint of blue. And so I'd like to see more of that, where you're pushing the more unusual colors that people don't expect to see. And I think that would be better. I would say in terms of your technique, my favorite part of this painting is actually the hair, because I feel that when I look at the hair, you let loose a lot more. I feel like in the rest of the painting, it's almost like you were a little too dictatorial about the marks, and you were very tight about trying to render every single section. The hair, you didn't do that. The hair, you went a little wild and you loosened up a lot. And I think the result of that is that the hair has this wonderful liveliness to it. It really feels very vibrant, feels like there's a sense of movement to it. There's this almost gloss to it that I think is really wonderful. I mean, I find the hair more engaging than the face. The face is beautifully painted, but it's also, again, very literal. It doesn't really offer me a lot. You have to ask yourself when you're doing these paintings, what does my painting offer visually that a photograph cannot? Because the thing is, we have all this technology that can reproduce images within a second that are just at a crazy level of resolution. And so I think that's made a lot of artists question, well, why are we still painting? Why are we still drawing? And so ask yourself, what can you paint that a photograph cannot make? Because I feel like in the clothing section of this painting, and also in the face, it feels like you are just trying to replicate the photo. The other funny thing about this piece is that he's doing this very quizzical sort of facial expression. He's like scratching his head. And so it seems like there should be a narrative in this piece, but I don't see any other indication of what he might be wondering about or what's going on. And then it's a little strange that you have this backdrop in the background. So that makes me think it's almost like a classroom setting. But the thing is, the gesture he's making doesn't look like a classroom setting. So I guess in this particular piece, I find the environment just really confusing. Like I'm just not really sure what's going on in here. So this is, I think, an example of a piece that you really need to think through the imagery. Like, who is this person? What are they doing? And what am I trying to say with this piece? And I think that will work out a lot better. Okay, I think it's pretty obvious looking at this piece that this is probably a classroom study, probably done from a model. And so I can definitely see how you probably didn't have control over that. I think the face is beautifully done. Again, wonderful representation of those cheekbones. You can really feel the bony structure in that area. And also, I think in the forehead, I really get a sense for that. And I think those really deep, dark cast shadows, the ones that are making the darkness of her eye sockets, the really dramatic one on her neck and the top of her chest, those areas I think are really helping the drama of this piece a lot. My favorite part of this piece, again, is actually the hair, because I think in the hair, what I see you doing, which you aren't doing in some of the other areas, is you're being much more efficient. And so what I mean by that is it's like in the hair part of this drawing, you're communicating just as much visual information, but you're saying it with fewer words. Whereas when I look at the breast area and I look at the arms, it seems like you really are using a lot of words to describe it. I mean, it's almost like if you think about an essay, like if you have an essay which is too wordy and really spells everything out for you, it's not a very interesting essay to read. Whereas if you have an essay that's very succinct and says a lot, but says it in very few words, that's usually a lot more pleasurable to read. Like I would say George Orwell was a writer who did that. He talked about very complex issues, social concerns, and he said it in so few words, but the words that he used were so poignant. And so that's what I see in the hair area, is that you have this like glistening light on that area where the hair connects to the forehead, and then you just barely show those strokes of the ponytail in the background, and that's so beautiful, the way that that hair just dissolves into that darkness. Whereas I feel like the arm on the left-hand side is almost too crisp. It's almost like too well articulated. The arm on the right is better because I think there you are starting to show some anatomical knowledge, and so that's helping quite a bit. But I do feel that sort of the neck down, there's a stiffness to the way that you're drawing, whereas I would say the head and the hair really have this liveliness to them that I think is beautifully done. It really makes me think about like Caravaggio's paintings, where he had very dramatic chiaroscuro lighting, and he really was very, very good at having a lot of his figures really dissolve into that darkness. So he's definitely somebody I would take a look at if you haven't seen his paintings before. He's really a master of lighting who I really think you would enjoy quite a bit. This piece I'm very excited about because this is the type of piece that you need more of. You need more pieces like this that deal with some type of particular subject matter. I mean, obviously this one's very much about current events because you have literally the symbol 2016, you have the Statue of Liberty and everything. And I just think in general, this is just a much more ambitious painting, because I think in a lot of your other compositions, it tends to be just one person and then a blank background. This one's not like that. You have the Statue of Liberty. I love the fact that her arm is just crossing through the entire composition, and there's a lot more depth. I like, for example, that there are these little people in between her arm and her face. You can see them in the background. You can see the airplanes. You've got the figure in the lower left-hand corner. You have all the stickers that are all over the Statue of Liberty. It's a really ambitious piece. I do think in terms of technique, my favorite part of this piece is actually the gown on the Statue of Liberty. I like the way that that area sort of melts into those figures. And I love the figures at the bottom left-hand corner because those figures are very hazy. They're not especially well articulated, but that's all they need. They don't need to be super articulated. They just are these anonymous figures, and that's super appropriate for the role that they play in this composition. So I would really push you to go in this direction because this piece, I think, really shows me what you're capable of, not just in terms of technique, but also in terms of thinking. I love that it's about current events. I mean, it's a really striking piece for that reason, so I'd push that further. This piece I don't think is a great portfolio piece. I can tell it's probably drawn from a cast or something. It probably was a good exercise for you to do just to learn about shading and lighting and stuff like that, but I think the fact that it's just stuck right in the middle of the page, you have no background, this probably isn't your best piece. I mean, technically speaking, it's okay, but I think a portfolio piece should be more ambitious. I think it should be a lot more accomplished. It should really try to bite off more. So this piece, I think I would eliminate from your portfolio. This piece too, I also think I would eliminate just because it doesn't really say anything new for me. I think that there's some very beautiful shading, obviously, in the face, but it's so unfinished. I mean, really obviously unfinished because you don't have anything in the background. It's really only the face. I mean, even your technique here, I think, is so stiff that it just doesn't have a lot of expression. Like, she just seems almost like a mannequin in a way. So I think what I might work on if you continue to do portraits is try to really highlight the character of that person. I mean, she seems so she seems like she has no personality at all. And I think the portraits that really interest me are the ones where you really feel like you know something about that person. Like there's a Géricault painting, I'll send it to you, that's called Portrait of a Mad Woman. And it's just the most incredible facial expression. Even though you don't know that person, you feel like you know what they're about. And this person is very anonymous, and your technique isn't particularly groundbreaking either. So I think this is another piece I would take out. This piece too, I also think I would remove just because it seems like it was copied from a photograph. I'm guessing it was from some historical photo you were doing. I mean, the technique of layering the white chalk and the black on top of the gray toned paper, that's a great technique to use. I mean, you're obviously getting some beautiful results, but I want to see you doing more in terms of ideas, and I want to see you drawing from life more. I mean, one thing you could think about is doing a self-portrait. You could work from images of your friends if they're sitting around. You could do some gesture drawings, but I think you got to get away from just sort of copying the photograph, because there isn't a lot going on here for me. I mean, it's almost like, I think when people copy too much from photographs, it's almost like you're just a human Xerox machine. Like, you're not really doing anything that artistic. This piece interests me because of the color. I don't like that it looks like such an obviously copied image from a photograph. That part I'm not thrilled with, but I think this is the one piece where I do think your color is really, really different than what I expected. Like that still life piece, I think it was so obvious the lime is green, the vase is orange, and this has some really weird, unexpected colors. My favorite part is probably the lip area, and then the blue underneath the lip, and then the sort of sheen of the chin, I think is very exciting. I mean, one thing you could try doing is if you're going to use a reference photo, take that reference photo and play with it more. Like, for example, the shadows that the eyelashes are making, exaggerate them more, make them 3 times longer than they actually are, and change it more, because I feel like there's too much of this copying going on. So this piece, I think, is a good piece in terms of you pushing your colors in a more dramatic way, because it seems like you were a little timid with the still life to do that. But I think this is where that risk-taking experimentation that I talked about earlier comes into play. And the thing that you have to be okay with, you have to be okay with making some bad artwork. That's just the way it goes. I always tell my students, at RISD, I say, look, if you guys want to make good drawings that are risky and exciting, you have to be okay making some bad ones. And so that's why I always say to students, look, if the college application is asking for 20 images, you need to make 40 images, because it's not guaranteed that every single one of those 20 pieces is going to be great, and you want to weed out the work which isn't as strong and really show your best work. You've got the technique. You just really need to pump up the thinking part of being an artist, the brainstorming, and I'm going to send you a tutorial about how to do that. This piece I'm interested in as well, because it does seem like there's some sort of a narrative going on. I'm not thrilled with the composition because, again, you've taken the figure and just stuck her right in the middle of the page. And quite frankly, I'm much more interested in the sort of shattered fragments that are in the left and in the right-hand corner. She's a lot less interesting to me. And so I wonder if you can flip the balance of this piece so that 80% of the piece is made up of the fragments, and maybe the fragments are almost like consuming her, or maybe she's barely there, maybe you see her through the fragments. It's like you have a good idea here, but I don't think you pushed it far enough. It's like you're just at the very beginning, and I see that a lot in student pieces, that students think of one idea and then they just do that. And actually, when you brainstorm, you can't just go with your first idea. You have to think about it for a while. You got to do a lot of sketches. For me, usually when I'm doing different ideas, it's not till the 20th idea until I find the version that I really want to do. So when you're brainstorming, you got to have patience with that. This piece too, color-wise, not particularly exciting. It seems like a lot of the shadow colors are a little bit dull. You're a little bit too reliant on the peach tone on the left-hand side. I would just really play with this and really get some better references, because the lighting on the shards is a little bit strange. I mean, I would literally like find a broken like piece of glass, or I don't know. You need to do something to this though, because I think you're relying too much on your imagination to show something, and so therefore the visual results are not as compelling. This piece I like in terms of your painting technique, because I see you really loosening up in the dress, especially in the hip area. That's the part of the painting I'm interested in, because you're much more efficient efficient with your brushwork, and you're not picking so much. Like, I feel like in a lot of your other paintings, you have a tendency to pick at certain areas. And in some ways, that's sort of where your technique, because it's so accomplished, is like a curse and a blessing. It's like, just because you can make it that detailed doesn't mean you should. This piece, I'd love to see you just push up the loosening of your brushwork more, because a lot of it's beautifully painted, but again, it just feels like this anonymous person. Like, I don't really know who she is. I don't know what she's doing. I do like that you gave her some kind of a context. Like, I like that it seems like she's seated on something. I don't know what it is, but you also have a very blank background. And so we, again, don't have much context for who she is. I think where you really need to work is your ideas and your subject matter, and make sure you're saying something as an artist. You don't want to just be a technician who just mechanically draws things. I'm not worried about whether you can render something, but that also means that you have to push yourself harder to do something that really is different.